Hogwarts Legacy is a big game, and it is definitely possible to lose a lot of time engaging with the open world before getting some very important tools that make the experience much smoother. If you're the kind of player that has a limited amount of time, or you simply enjoy the feeling of knowing that you are making the right efforts at the right moment, then there is definitely a correct order in which you want to approach the content this game offers. Now, before delving into the video, I feel the need to make an important premise. There is no right or wrong way to have fun, so if wandering about the map exclusively on foot for hours on end is what tickles your fancy, you should very well keep doing that, no matter what I or anyone else says about it. Fun is subjective after all, and it is the sole purpose of any game, so that's the only thing you should care about in the end. With that out of the way, we can jump right into making sure you get the absolute best results with the least amount of time, starting with the first and most important step. You should focus on progressing through the main story and completely ignore any side activity up to a certain point. While it is fascinating to gain access to the entire map almost immediately after the prologue, that also means you are thrusted into a world that offers a huge amount of tasks, side quests, puzzles, collectibles, and in general hundreds of shiny curious things that will totally make you forget about the main story. However, taking part in any side activity at this point in the game is without a doubt the worst thing you could possibly do when it comes to making the most out of your playtime for a whole bunch of different reasons. First, you still have no broom to carry you around, so you will be forced to cover the distance to whatever destination you have chosen on foot. Despite being good for burning calories, it is definitely not ideal from a time perspective, especially if you consider that you will get access to fast and unlimited flight. Second, you have yet to learn many basic spells that will let you properly complete tasks as soon as you encounter them, meaning you will lose time in trying to figure out the solution to a puzzle that you just cannot solve yet, until eventually having to skip it and be forced to come back later. Third, you do not have the tool to open anything that is locked, whether it is a chest or a door, and you really want to be able to open things as soon as you stumble upon them while completing other stuff. Everything you cannot open right away is, once again, another thing that will force you to invest a bunch of time retracing your steps. Fourth, you still have not obtained the Room of Requirement, which is your main source of everything really. From potions to plants to materials for upgrading your gear, with a little management, the room automatically generates stuff for you while you play. So every minute spent in-game before having unlocked it is a loss of resources that the room could have provided you in the meantime. While there are other minor reasons I could add to the list, I believe at this point you got the general gist, so I'll just stop here. Long story short, while progressing through the main story before going for side content is generally a good idea in many open-world games, in Hogwarts Legacy the number of tools gated behind having reached certain points in the storyline is borderline ridiculous. Going around before having acquired them will cost you hours of revisiting places you have already seen a bunch of times just to get that single collectible hidden behind a puzzle or a lock, which is not an ideal use of your time. It goes without saying that you absolutely should still collect all things that you naturally find while progressing through the story, namely field guide pages, since they provide a good chunk of experience that is required to gain the levels you need to actually start the questlines. However, you should avoid getting out of your way to achieve other stuff until you have completed the first major step in the story, and you see the first season change, which is when you are finally granted the ability to learn the unlocking charm Alohomora. But since things are never as easy as it seems, not even in video games apparently, there is an additional issue you basically need to address immediately, since the spell will initially only open level 1 locks, and will need to be upgraded in order to open level 2 and eventually level 3. That inevitably brings us to the second step, which is to level up your Alohomora before doing anything else. This is done by collecting demiguise statues scattered all over the map and turning them over to the quest guy. You will need 9 statues for the level 2 upgrade and 13 for the third and final one, making it a pretty hefty task to complete. Although you will need to fully upgrade the spell eventually, getting the second level is way faster than getting the third, since both Hogwarts and Hogsmeade have 7 statues you can get your hands on fairly easily, and without needing to invest time to travel to faraway villages. When taking into account that there are only a handful of level 3 locks when compared to level 1 and level 2, it is much more beneficial working towards getting level 2 as soon as possible, and then just focus on other stuff, leaving the completion of the quest to later on in the game. When it comes to where the statues are located, there are plenty of guides around that can tell you everything you need, and I'll make one myself soon because why not really? But if you want to avoid any external help, in my opinion, Hogsmeade is definitely the best place to clear out first, since it's much smaller than Hogwarts and much easier to navigate, which makes locating the statues by using Revelio to see through walls much faster. The other 2 statues you need to grab from Hogwarts in order to get your Alohomora upgrade are fairly easy to collect as well, since you have already seen both just by playing through the main story. One in Professor Fig's classroom and the other one in the restricted section of the library. Upon having gathered what you need, you can hand them in to the quest guy and finally take a breather, knowing that you won't have to leave the vast majority of locked stuff behind and come back at a later date to get it, saving precious time in the process. Since we are talking about saving time by unlocking stuff, here's a bonus tip. You probably already know that using Alohomora requires you to complete a very basic and quite frankly not that fun minigame in which you have to rotate the 2 gears into the correct place, and that changing the game difficulty into story mode gives you an autocomplete option that makes you skip the process altogether. While that is absolutely possible, I do believe that going through the motions needed to change the game settings every time you need to open a lock is actually slower than just doing the minigame manually, unless you are very unlucky with the starting position of the gears. Of course, it comes down to personal preference in the end, and if you just cannot stand having to do the bloody thing, a few seconds more or less do not matter that much. Now that you have made sure you can collect most of the little chest icons that might appear on your minimap, it is time to focus your efforts on the place that gets you all the juicy stuff you will use during your adventures. So the next step is managing your room of requirement. At this point of the storyline, you still lack the tool to rescue beasts, but there is definitely one thing you need to fire up in order to squeeze just about everything the room has to offer, and that is buying the Hopping Pot spellcraft as soon as humanly possible. Although it comes at the hefty cost of 3,000 Galleons, you can have a total of 3 active at the same time, and those bad boys will brew 1 random potion every 12 minutes completely on their own. If you remember to collect what they have produced fairly often, the Hopping Pots will be more than enough to cover all of your brewing needs for the assignments or quests that will require you to provide potions, which also means you won't need to worry about growing the ingredients that brewing would normally require. Do, however, keep in mind that Hopping Pots only brew potions that you would normally be able to produce yourself, so make sure to buy every recipe from the appropriate vendor as soon as you have the money to do so. Another advantage of not having to worry about potions and their ingredients is that it also makes deciding how to use your small pots completely trivial, since you should only ever use the ones you have to grow Mallowsweet, which is what you will need to start each of the Merlin trials, so it's never a bad idea to have a consistent production. Now that locks will no longer prevent you from getting most of the stuff you find, and the room of requirement is working while you play, you are pretty much set to start going about the game without worrying about wasting time in activities for which you might not have the correct tools. Before wrapping up this optimization journey, there are still a few very useful tips I can give you that will save you a bunch of time. To start things out, you might be surprised to know that you don't need to care about magical beasts as much as you probably think you should. Although the materials they provide are pretty rare and you do need to collect them every now and then, upgrading your gear and imbuing traits is only really necessary once you get to the high tiers of play. And even then, you do not really need that many for each upgrade. As long as you capture a male and a female of every beast that is available, and remember to do your chores about every hour or so, you'll have more than enough to fully level up any single piece of gear you find during your travels, and there is no use for beast materials other than that, so it's not like you can sell any excess you may have, and most likely will have, to be honest. Next on the list, it might be useful to know that there's not much practical use for Galleons. The only purchases you really need to gain value other than cosmetics are your first broom that you should buy as soon as it becomes available, the 3 upgrades for your broom that you'll get by completing the vendor questline, the hopping pot spellcraft that we already mentioned, and the beast feeder spellcraft that your very own Deke will suggest you buy, and rightfully so. Putting one into each of your vivariums is highly recommended, since your creatures will be automatically fed as soon as you enter, so you'll only need to pet them in order to gather their materials, which is pretty handy when you have almost 50 beasts to take care of. Other things you can buy that make some small impact on your gameplay are the remaining spellcrafts and the seeds for magical plants, which will allow you to grow an insane amount of stuff. Whether you think that is beneficial or not is actually up to you, since it largely depends on how many consumables you use in combat. If you like the herbologist playstyle and have invested talent points in the Room of Requirement tree, you will likely want to have as many of that stuff as possible and organize yourself accordingly. Otherwise, you can happily start buying cosmetic stuff you like without worrying that you might be wasting money you could spend on more useful items, since there are none other than the ones I just mentioned. Last tip, make sure you collect Moonstone as you travel around the world. The Material Refiner spellcraft that you buy from the same guy where you bought everything else is definitely useful, and there is no real reason not to put some in the room once you have it, but if spending those 1500 galleons delays your other important purchases, it's totally not worth it. Moonstone deposits are easy to identify, and some basic whips of your wand will guarantee that you do not need to worry about it pretty much ever, at least to create all the non-cosmetic stations. And that concludes the most important things you can do to gain the most out of your playtime. Make sure to write in the comments if you reached the same conclusions during your gameplay, or will try to consider them on your next playthrough. If you like my content, you can subscribe to the channel by clicking on the icon that appears now on the right. Doing so would really help me a lot in continuing my journey here on YouTube. As always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.